On behalf of Akuno Senko for Bay, you know what I'm saying? Jay, where you at? We're trying to help our people elevate. Hope. Hope. We're giving them hope. We doing what we gotta do, you know. Every day, one step at a time, man. We gonna make it happen. Helping our people elevate. Yeah. Sometimes I practice focus, thought, and meditate. I'm trying to come with other ways to help our people elevate and seeking knowledge, make me levitate. The lifted mental state is what results from how we orchestrate. This for the family's sake. Let's self-reflect and self-evaluate. And every day, make sure the steps you take, you calculate. Receive a master's fate. I know I can't exist without the hate, but that's okay. I balance that with higher self today. Success is on this way, and after that, my flesh can pass away.
All right, peace, family. I'm back with another one. This is gonna be part 2. On the last one, we almost hit 400. You know what I'm saying? So I want to say it's not your numbers, but you know what I mean. I want to say I thank you. You know what I'm saying, for your last visit.
No problem, man. Every little bit helps. You know, everything is all to the good.
You know. So as I told the people, we're gonna give them a part 2. You know, so this is part 2. And, we got 2 subjects we want to dig into. You know, the rise and fall of the Moorish Empire, you know, the 800-year empire. And
right.
I want you, if you can, explain that America is the old world, or how America, what we know today is America being the old world.
Right.
And I yield.
Islam. Well, first, thanks to everybody for tuning in, and thank you for having me on once again. You know what I mean? Honest to all of the Moors who came before us, you know what I mean? And everybody that's been striving to, you know, live their life and make Moorish, the Moorish culture a viable lifestyle option for ourselves, our families, and our children today, you know? As opposed to a lot of the different factions that are vying for so-called melanated people's consciousness, you know what I mean? Everybody has a voice and everybody has a means to express themselves how they want, especially when it comes to culturally. It's just that we've been inundated over the past 150 years to totally forget a huge aspect of our national and cultural identity as the descendants of the last true, I would say, empire that existed here on this planet, that is responsible for all of the modern conveniences and stuff that we're living with today. You know what I mean? So I definitely wanted to, you know, follow up with that. As far as America being a new world, I mean, being the old world, we existed at a time when there was nobody on the planet but us. You know what I'm saying? And by us, I'm talking about melanated people in general. You know what I mean? And we also existed from the time when everything was basically dark. You know what I mean? And then went out of that triple stage darkness into a modern epoch in which we were basically telling time by the moon, and then we were telling time by the sun, and then we were telling time by the stars. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So by the time we culminated as a people, we culminated into that in terms of using the sun, moon, and stars as a Quranic time marker for the amount of time that we've existed. There's a school of thought that says the square circumference of the planet is 24,896 miles. And from there, we round that up to 25,000. And therefore, every time we reach 25,000 years, we basically go back and so-called reset and start from that time on to another 25,000. So there's really never been a time that we haven't been here, you know what I mean, as a unified people. It's just they want us to believe that we evolved and descended from monkeys and things like Homo habilis and Homo sapien, and Homo habilis, and then Homo erectus, and then Homo sapien, and then Homo sapiens sapien, and then, you know, all this other shit. But in the root of it all, we've never seen any verification of a monkey transferring itself into a human form. We've never seen that. So therefore, all of that is conjecture and is based upon somebody's understanding of who we are that needs to exist in a manner that allows them to have an existence at the time that they didn't. And when you date yourself based on somebody else's dates, you naturally box yourself out of where you initially began from. And we have no birth record. You know what I'm saying? They just did the University of South Carolina just did a whole source on the Perry family and found that the patrilineal DNA that extended from father to son, they could trace back to over 385,000 years. And that's just in South Carolina, because South Carolina basically is the East. You know what I'm saying? So when they talk about the Far East or the Orient, and things like that, they talk about the Maghreb al-Aqsa, which is everything from Mali all the way over to the Mississippi. You know what I mean? Or even farther over to the Nueces and the Bravo rivers, which, according to the congressional record of 1845, was the natural boundaries between the ancient Mauritanians, i.e. the Moorish Empire, or the ancient Moors, such as the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Phrygians, the Parthians, the Fomorians, the ancient Carthaginians, you know what I'm saying? And all of those that came prior, you know what I mean? As well as the Moorish peoples, who were the inheritors of those ancient Mauritanian so-called races. And then under us, we had what they refer to as the Indian Associates, which were and are the combination or the genetic admixture of us dealing with the imported people that were brought over here through the many wars and the many tribulations that happened between, let's say, the fall of the empire, which was in 492, aka 1492, to about 1770, to about, let's say the first fall was, let's say, from 492, aka 1492, to about 1555. Then from 1555 or 555 all the way up to about 667. Then the last fall was, let's say, from 667 to about 1791. And then even then, we still had major sway over the global empire, global population, and the fact that it was split now between what they call the barbarian empire and the Tartarian empire, which was the Moors from the west and the Moors from the Moors from the farthest west that we see in what they call septentrional maps, which are maps of the extreme west. And those maps of the Far East, where we get people like Tamerlane and who they call Timur, Temujin, who they call Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, you know what I mean? All of the Khans, who they also refer to as the Prestas or Presta Johns. You see what I'm saying? That Marco Polo had to give tribute to in order to come back on this side of the world. So we've had rise and fall and rise and fall, but between all of that, we were here when the whole planet, when the whole landmass was one landmass. We was properly able for you to walk from Brooklyn to South America, from South America over to Australia, from Australia up into so-called Africa, from Africa further up into so-called Europa, and so forth and so on. So we always been in a position to naturally carve out what land was which, you know what I mean, who we were going to interbreed with and who we were going to let come into certain spheres of influence in terms of civilization. This can be bared out in books like The Anacalypsis by Gerald Maxey, volumes 1 to 3. It can be bore out into all of the ancient names of these ancient places, like the ancient Chinese, the ancient Chinese who are the Xiang, you know what I mean? The ancient so-called Nipponese, aka Japanese, who we'll call the Anu, you know? The ancient Indians, who we call the Dravidians, you know what I'm saying? The ancient Europeans, who are called the Grimaldi, you know what I mean? The ancient so-called West Asians, West European, they're called the Kennewick man, as well as what they refer to as the Cheddar man. We can look as far as the ancient bones of the Guadalupe woman here in South America. You see what I'm saying? So there's never been a place or continent that we were at that we weren't the first people there. It's just that after a successive migration, successive wars, successive exoduses, you know what I'm saying? These people consolidate themselves and move into other places, and then they're brought, and then other people are then brought there who came after them. You know what I mean? Like, there's really no such thing as an Aztec. Like, that was a word that was created by so-called modern archaeologists to try to differentiate the so-called ancient Mayans from the so-called Olmecs. You see what I'm saying? Which means that it's a word of art. Yet you have people doing whole anthropological papers and stuff like that on these people called Aztecs, when they know that that name is a modern word that they just kind of created to differentiate the different types of melanated people. We can find this out in the book Unexpected Faces in Ancient America by Alexander von Luthernau. You know what I'm saying? When he described all of the images and the people that they were finding, the remnants of them wearing Moorish headgear. You know what I mean? He described it as Moorish, you know what I mean? And then we can even go further back to another civilization called Coralla Supe. That's down here in so-called South America as well, in the ancient Americas as well. So because they want us in a modern sense not to have any ancient connection to anybody of the ancient world, they want to make it seem like our physiology, the way we look now, is because of some sort of Caucasoid or so-called slave master who happened to be pheomelanin deficient, raping our ancestors. You know what I mean? As if they could ever rape as many people as we look like today. You dig? So they want to use that as a way to, one, make us always seem like we're a victimized race that we was never able to fight back, or, you know what I mean, was always at the whim of somebody else. And then two, to make it seem like we as men could never defend our women from the onslaught of other nations' rapacious appetites, sexual appetites and stuff. And then three, to make it like our genetics is somehow younger or somehow inferior to people from the continent of Africa, when that's emphatically not true. That's just something that they want to do to make it so that way we never have our individual identity and be able to fight off all of these fake histories that they keep bestowing on us, because we keep referring to ourselves by names and words of art that they create for us.
So
when none of that's true.
I have a question. I've read that there are more pyramids in the Americas than there are in Africa. Is that correct?
Yeah. Only difference is the pyramids over here aren't necessarily pyramids, meaning that they didn't come to a pyramidian point. They came to a level plane, which means that they were more what they call step pyramids or trapezoids. Mm-hmm. So each one of those has a different function. So the pyramidions in what they call Africa and the continent over there, as well as in Europe and shit, they all come to a point because the energy that they were summiting to the apex was going out. Mm. Whereas over here, all of the energy that was put out was then brought back down. You understand? Okay. So we always kept things on the level, which is also symbolic of the fez and why that was such an ancient headgear for us and was transported over there. There's a book you can get called The Algonquin Conquest of the Mediterranean Region in 11,500, which coincides to the last burgeoning ice age, which then means that we from over here went and colonized them over there. You see what I'm saying? And set up all the ancient societies that would become societies over there. And then they eventually came back over here once those societies started to go into a decline. That's why in a lot of ancient maps you'll see that the world in especially around the age of the Asian dominant, from the Scythian people to the Thracians to the who they refer to as the Magyars, to the ones that they were eventually referred to as the Mongols or the Tartars or the Tartarians. You see what I'm saying? All of them, when they were ruling the world, they only split the world on their maps where you had so-called Africa, Europa, and Asia. Over here was totally cut off from them because they had no sway over here. They could only come over here by way of the sultans and the ancient mariners that allowed them to do so.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So, so when you really get into the readings and the writings of Marco Polo and all of that, he talks about, the great Khans, you know what I mean, in the farthest west, or what they refer to as the Orient. So when they say the Far East, they're really talking about the farthest west. Because the farther east you go, let's say all the way to Russia, right? You wind up in the west, past what they refer to as the Bering Strait, now into Khalifa. You know what I'm saying? Same thing, if you go from the western portion of Africa, you come to the eastern portion of the United States. You know what I'm saying? So, i.e., that would be the farthest east.
Okay, yeah.
Which on a lot of the old maps, they refer to those nations as the barbarous nations, whether it would be the Algonquin, the Seneca, the Montaka, the Wabanaki, the Abenaki, the Muskogee, the Mosk, Skogie, you see what I'm saying? The Chartalagi, you know what I mean? Anytime you got Gee, G-H-E-E, that's more. That's like Portuguese, you know what I mean? Cherokee, you know what I mean? Chartalagi, all of that is Moorish. That's an old Moorish Punica type thing. But we went through stages. So you have the ancient, what they refer to as the ancient Canaanites, and then you had different clans within that. And then one of those clans that broke away were those who crossed over the river, who they refer to as the Hebrews, or the so-called 12 tribes. But Hebrew is not a people. It's a language structure. You see what I'm saying? That was adopted from the Paleo Hebrew, i.e. the Old Phoenician, which again, they could also refer to as Berberic, Libyan Berberic Latin. See what I'm saying? So it still brings you back here, because when you read the book Saga America by Barry Fell, they find all of these old mosques all the way over there in what is now Nevada, California, and all of that, and it all has the same ancient Libyan, what they call Kufic script, which predates Arabic. You see what I'm saying? By at least 10,000 years. You know what I mean? And then before that, you have the Tamil speakers. You see what I'm saying? From the old Dravidian sects, who eventually moved into what they refer to as Ethiopia. You see what I'm saying? And then converted that to an aspect of Gez or Giz. You see, after those people moved the capital from Liabella to Axum. There's a group of people, there's a whole Turkish group in Ethiopia called the Turkana, you know what I mean, that predate the Axumites, who are referred to as the Turks over there. So we got Turks over there, we got the Sumner Turks over here against South Carolina, you know what I mean, in America. And then we have the Osman Ali's, what you call Turks, that's over there in what they refer to as Turkey today, who eventually all got displaced and their identities adopted by the Slavonic people, you see what I'm saying, who were brought in there after the Great Tribulations and the wars and all
that. I'm just sitting here learning. I feel like I'm in a class. You bringing up Turkish people, and I didn't want to kind of go off subject, but the concept or the symbology of turkeys and Thanksgiving.
Right.
Can you go into that a little bit?
That's like the mystic Turks. So there's the Turkish people today who they all adopted the fez and imported fezes from Morocco, from the Empire of Morocco back in the late 1800s. because they wanted to, again, adopt a certain national identity to go along with the new stuff they was doing. Because you had what they called the Seljuks, right? And then you had these were all the Abashi, right? These are all like subdivision groups. These is when they started amalgamating. And so Turkey itself, or let's say Istanbul or Constantinople, was taken by Muhammad II, peace be upon him. And he was a dark-skinned Moor. We got paintings of him entering into Turkey, or what they call Turkey now. You see what I'm saying? And he darker than both of us. You did? Okay. And he was preceded by nothing but Moors and all that. They repainted a lot of those pictures and stuff like that once they got a Greek to take over called the Ataturk. And this dude was a white Greek backed by the Jewry at that time to basically abolish the fez that they had only been wearing for about 100 years prior to that, and then get them into a secular type of thing so that way they can make the modern face of Turkey what it is today. When that dude was really from Cyprus, he was a Cypriot who was imported there, you see what I'm saying, to get rid of the dark Turks. So over there today, you have a whole group of original so-called Turkic Osman Ali descendants, but they refer to them as Afro-Turks. See? And they give them the false history that they was enslaved and they was brought over there and then turned into eunuchs and all this bullshit. And that's not really true either. That's just, again, to keep them in power, the lighter skinned ones in power, so that way they could, go along with their version of history, because all of these people got there around the turn of the century, right around the time of Reconstruction, when they were reconstructing everything and creating everything, you see what I'm saying, and moving everybody everywhere. Mm-hmm. While we're fighting the wars over here to preserve what was left, they're then using that to now bring new people into these areas, rewrite the history, and then make them the modern face, everything be light skinned or what we consider white, but not WHIT white, WIGHT white.
Right, because there is a difference. Yeah, you're
right. Right. Because according to the Black's Law Dictionary, in order for you to be a free white person to be accepted in these places, you had to be everything except Caucasian. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even the term Caucasian don't really mean what we consider to be white or whatever, because that's not really real either. Because to be Caucasus Asian is somebody that's sequestered from Asia. Caucasus being a separate group, Asia being the place. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's a bunch of chicanery, a bunch of lying and shit going on, you know what I mean?
Okay, so now let's dig into if we can, let's get into the rise and the fall. I mean, because I'm still a student, so I'm familiar with the Moors going up into Spain, the Moors going up into Europe, and all the great things that they brought. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure you have some names and some dates, you know what I mean? I'm sure you can go into a little bit more detail about exactly what took place.
You could start to really date everything from the time of about 70 AD. That's when the Temple of Jerusalem or Jerusalem falls to the Roman state, and then the so-called 12 tribes get split up, because the 12 tribes were chosen by themselves. Like, they chose to break away from the rest of the ancient Canaanite peoples, right? Who by this time had become different clans or tribes, you know what I mean? So they broke away and they agreed to adopt the worship of a storm god. That storm god they refer to as Yahweh, right? But there's the spiritual aspect of that, and then there's how they try to take the spiritual aspect and turn that into a physical thing. So they chose to do that and then intermingle between themselves, because they were not one people. In their own Bible, it says that they were a mixed multitude that left so-called Egypt or Kemet, right? And then they wandered them 40 years as the story goes. And then from there, they decided that they were going to then consolidate themselves as a kingdom. But because they broke their own covenant with this storm god, or with this entity, and started to go back to worship the ancient god that they had been worshiping, which was Baal, right? or also Molech, right? Who was depicted as a golden calf. So that also is symbolic of Hathor, right? So because of that and that covenant that they broke, they then fell victim to the so-called Romans, right? Who themselves are not Caucasian. You know what I mean? They're still mostly melanated, if not lighter skinned. You see what I'm saying? And they were okay with still going around with the pagan worship. And so they went in and shut down their kingdom. And from that point on, they were forbidden to have a kingdom based upon their own transgression. That's what their story says. Okay? So Yeshua, who they refer to as Yeshua, Ben coming from the line of David or Daud, was supposed to be the deliverer. He was supposed to be the sign that, you know, the new kingdom was going to enact itself, right? According to their stories and stuff. Yet they received him not, and then went through the whole story about him being, you know, crucified and all that. You did? So there's the physical aspect of that, and then there's a true spiritual aspect of that that they still never really dealt with. You know what I mean? That they keep on the low. Because most Hebrew Israelites are Christians. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But Yeshua, the guy that they say is their God, said that he was the Son of Man. You understand? So there's a disconnect in that. And that disconnect came through the so-called establishment of the Roman state, who now that they had these so-called Hebrews in their wake, they went to the core who was ruling over them. And that core was called the Sadducees or the Pharisees, okay? And after 70 AD, they joined up with the Roman state, and as well as the Babylonian, what was left of the Babylonian states, and they started to create something called the Talmud, right? Which had nothing to do with the Torah. This is now a conglomeration of all of their ancient deities and stuff that they had been practicing that is now going to be put in a form of spellbinding that they would now be able to rule over other people with.
Okay.
And use that to control. So there was a Moor named Arius, okay? And Arius took them to court. He took Constantine and them to court and basically let them know that this version that they were working on through the Council of Nicaea, which again is all melanated people. We got the images, we got the ancient pictures of these people. Mm-hmm. They was all melanated and all of that. So that would mean Constantine was that as well. But in modern reconstructional history, he has to be Caucasian in order for them to have the white face to hide the true reality of what was really going on. Okay. So Arius took them to court and said that this version of Christianity that they was using is actually a perverted form. Because the reason why the Hebrews broke away from the Egyptians and all of that, as well as the ancient Phoenicians and the ancient Moorish and all of that, was because there was a war between us as to fighting against these deities, these ancient so-called gods that were created by the hands of man. You understand? And people were then using these images and these deifications and these fake rituals, which is another form of Freemasonry, to be able to control the populace through blood sacrifice and all of that. So a lot of us wasn't with that. You understand? Mm-hmm. So we warred against each other to stop each other from doing that type of shit. And that's where they started to then go into gene therapy and started to trying to upgrade the Neanderthals and shit, and then force the false image of the Neanderthal type Christ on the people that didn't look like that as a means of control. You understand? So makes sense. So between 70 AD and about, let's say 80 AD, you get basically the fall of Rome. Now Rome starts to fall because Arius, him and his people was threatened with death. So at that time, the Romans were calling the Moors, but they were also referring to them as the Arianus Afrius Empire.
Afrius Empire.
Yeah, the Arianus Afrius Empire, right? This is where we get the term Aryan from.
Okay.
There's a book called Time Walker by Meredith Quinn. He gets into that aspect of this as well. because these Moors were also a mixed multitude as well. You had some of them that was kind of Dravidian, right? And now they're fighting against the Brahmins, right? And the Hindu, because they trying to bring they gods, right? And put that above the people, you know what I mean? Then you got the traditional Moors, you know what I'm saying? That's now fighting against the Baal worship, because Baal is just a corruption of Baal, right? So they took that and then started creating gods for that to get people to sacrifice to him, right? So we fighting against that. Then you got these Romans now, they trying to take what the whole Yeshua situation was about and then turn that into Christianity, you see? So we as the Arianius Empire and all that, we wasn't with none of that. So we shutting all of that down, right? So we're fighting against them. And so we start to consolidate ourselves into different pockets against all of this global idol worship, right? This is post-flood as well. So around the time that the Antichrist comes, the Antichrist being Nero, right? Because also Justinian Constantine, that's JC, that's Jesus Christ. Then he had a son, you see what I'm saying, he was seen as God, remember? So then he had a son who was then the son of God, right? His son. And now they are now taking Christianity now and using that as a means now to control all of the Hebrew Israelites that's under their control, all of the Romans that's under their control, and now they're turning the Church of Rome into the mother church. Because remember, the Church of Rome existed before Yeshua, or the story of, you know what I mean, or the consolidated story of who they're referring to as Yeshua, aka Jesus, because that was also Serapis Christus, right? So they merge all of this together. They get Zeus, Iusus, they get Serapis Christus, they get the sun god, right? Who's a version of Ra. They throw all of this in. They get the transfiguration in there, so you can eat his blood and eat his body in the form of the bread, and then drink his blood, right? Which is then the whole, you know, pagan
ritual.
Right, pagan ritual worship. Then they bring his mother in because they got to bring the goddess worship in. You see what I'm saying? We had just broken away from that because you had a whole sect called the Medusites. And these Medusites, going back into the Bronze Age, they was literally hunting men. You know what I mean? They would hunt men and find them. And in order for them to be married, they would have to kill 3 men. And then the 4th one be the one they married to have a baby with. And then once the baby had with that man, then they would cut him up, create a burnt offering, go into one of the temples, right? And then put the body parts in there and then burn that up to whatever goddess, whether it was Minerva or Medusa or Semiramis or any of these goddesses that they be worshiping in the sororities today. You know what I'm saying? They doing all of that. So it was the patriarchy, right? The Moors, who basically shut all of that shit down. You know what I'm saying? Like, we shut all of that down and made it safe for men and women to have babies and stuff like that and live by a certain creed, right? So much so that this was a lifestyle option, lifestyle choice that we didn't even really give a name to. It became what we refer to as Islam, right? Or the true version of Islam, right? Prior to the birth of who they refer to as Muhammad. That was basically based upon the universal principle, you know what I'm saying, of what the prophet consolidated as love, truth, peace, freedom, justice, and equality, right? But back in this time, it's something that we're just doing as a, hold on a second, as a contravention against all of this pagan idolatry and worship. We just put it in the
I'm sorry to go and do that right now.
It's all good. Hold on a second.
Hold on. Hold on. You good here?
Sorry about that.
No, you good.
So he or they, after taking him to court, and then after they try to put a death order on Arius and the rest of them, they basically, like I said, consolidated as a force and then started to move against Rome and all of its many factions. You see what I'm saying? And this led to the destruction of what we call Rome after the fall of the so-called Antichrist, who again was Nero. And then once he is fallen, that's when Mount Vesuvius erupts, right? And then that casts the great cloud over all of those areas. And then that's when we just start going full tilt on all of that. And we start expanding. And we start getting rid of all of these pagans and all of that. So these Romans were so fractured by the end that once this came all tumbling down, we, i.e., our great Moorish ancestors, our ancient Mauritanian ancestors, began to consolidate a means of establishing what we would consider a world governance based on freedom. And so different factions began to spring up. One of those came at the behest of, like I said, the Moorish Empire moving up into Western Asia, what they call Europa, right? And basically moving into the western portion of the continent of what they call Africa, and then establishing all of that, because up until that point, they had pushed a lot of the Moors from that portion of what they call Egypt, right, or Kemet and Nubia, and then pushed them west. Because Ethiopia and all of that, remember, they initially came from the so-called Ethiopian, which is really a Greek or type Creek word. They initially had a Dravidian base, and then they got pushed out of that. And then those Ethiopians then adopted their version, right, of the worship of Yeshua, which is really just the ancient understanding of the hero's journey, right? That they consolidated as that. Then they moved from there. They displaced the Liabellan capital, right, of those ancient Turkanas and those ancient Nubians, whatever, and then moved it to Axum. Then as Axumites under Elisban and Azania, right, they then consolidate, mix with the Sabaeans, and then move up into Europa and build one of the first colleges up there. And then those wild so-called tribes that was there, one of them tribes, the people that was already there were called the Etruscans or the Levantines. And then they wind up getting usurped, right, by this new influx of these people. And then they consolidate themselves as what we call Romans. You see what I'm saying? In the portion of the boot that they call Italy and all of that, right? That's why years later, centuries later, you get the war between Ethiopia and Italy. You know what I'm saying? Because Selassie, who they refer to as Selassie, also had a Italian name, which was Victor or Victor Emmanuel. You know what I mean? Because he was a consolidated emperor of both. That's why when he got into conflict and he had to leave Ethiopia, he didn't go to no other African nation. He went into Europa. You see what I'm saying? Because everybody goes ancestrally where they from. And then he was received by the British. See? So, so around that time, or going back, you get the rise now of again, what the Romans are referring to as the Arianius Afrius Empire. And then they start to basically expand and start to redo everything and put everybody back on an even kilt. Because by this time, they're in the Dark Ages, right? Now, remember, an age is what, 2,496 years?
Yeah, I'm about to say 26, but yeah, somewhere
around then. So if they say Dark Ages, you don't really know how long that existed in.
Mm-hmm.
Ages now, that's plural. So this is many, many multi-centuries that we're ruling stuff while these people are totally in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
While these people don't have no means of sustaining themselves. The only beacons of civilization is the civilizations that we've now established, right? Because we're now coming in the name of the true kingdom that is coming from within. That's why we have such high levels of technology and civilization and all of that. Because everybody else was beset and cursed by dealing with all of this pagan worship and all of this idolatry and all of this human sacrifice and all this other shit. We're now bringing the exact opposite of that, which is why if you look at the way Yeshua was dressed, or how he's always depicted, and how the Moors always were depicted, it's the same habit, it's the same gear.
Same attire, yeah.
Same attire, same headdresses, same type of thing, because we're now the embodiment of this. You understand?
We see today when we dress, we see how they imitate our dress attire. Same thing, yeah. I'm following.
Exactly. This is how we are now in tune and in toning how that is. So, when they refer to that so-called ancient Hebrew, they really referring to it is really talking about the Punica or the ancient Paleo-Hebrew, which is really Phoenician. Because all phonetics, all vowels, now all that come from the Moors, come from the Phoenicians, who had the global maritime empire around this time as well. And so we're popping it up in Europa, we're popping it in Asia, we're popping it in parts of Africa. The term Africa is a Latin word. You understand? Which means a far land, right? We're naming that. No Africans speak Latin. You dig? So we named that. You dig? The Roman Vulgate Latin is like pig Latin to how we were speaking it, because they had to adopt what we gave back to them. You see what I'm saying? During those dark ages. So at the time that Plato and Socrates and these people is living, they're living in the ruins of everything that we destroyed. You understand? And they're making up. They have to travel to other places and try to put together what happened, because they wasn't there. We brought about this new millennial so-called kingdom, as they talk about, and ushered in the new millennial reign or millennial kingdom of what they're referring to as Christ, or the crusher, because we came in and crushed all of that old stuff. We made it not popular to sacrifice, where you didn't have to do all this other type of stuff, where we didn't even change the physiology and the food, the agricultural needs of the whole planet. You understand? Like, how did oranges get to Europe? How did pumpkins get to Japan? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, where was they getting corn from? You know what I'm saying? Like, all that stuff came from over here. So we're using this brain now, this time, to bring about all of this new technology, all of these new so-called buildings and Tartarian stuff and all this stuff. We're creating all of that and bringing people in and remodifying them. We're creating giant bells to be able to heal people when they go into different areas and stuff. Like, you notice you don't really hear church bells like that no more.
Right, yeah, you're right.
You dig? Because we were using the bells to keep it so that way all of these spirits and these demons that was possessing these people couldn't exist. They couldn't stay around us because everything was so high in a vibration. And then we're not only bringing that, we're bringing the technology. We're creating aqueducts. We're erecting buildings with sound, with somatic tones and all of that. Like, we was off the chain with this shit. So that is when you hear people talk about the millennial reign of Christ and all this other stuff, that's the Moorish Empire they're talking about. And that lasted for over, I would say, over 1,000 years. Definitely from the time of the fall of the first temple, right? All the way up to what we consider, what they were saying is 1492. So let's say 70 BC. They say it's AD, but I would say it's BC. So from 70 BC all the way up now to 14 or 492 AD. Or what they call 1492 AD. So from that point, everything in that time frame is us bringing everything about, making sure everybody was free, everybody's fed, everybody has education, right? And then due to now the rise again of this ancient evil within us, right, which is the lower self, they start becoming a bit more lax, you see? And they allow these Romans, who are now referring to themselves as Europeans, right, to have their titles back, because the Moors, as a consolidated now in the Moorish Empire, they start to break down into what they call taifas. These taifas were like feudal kingdoms amongst themselves, in which they now start to employ the wood wolves, right? Who are the wild savage beastmen, right? To use them to invade other Moorish lands. You see what I'm saying? And then mate with Moorish women and stuff. And then the seed of that then gets put into things like Janissary corps or Mameluke corps. You see what I'm saying? To now be able to also partially inherit certain things. You see what I'm saying? Based upon this lineage, and now based upon them coming in, a lot of the high level understanding stuff gets cut off, because we got to preserve that. So we start cutting that off, and then started creating lesser sciences for these things to exist in, because they now being brought into civilization, whether we like it or not. And then thus we then start to fall to the less noble nature. And then we start to fight more against ourselves. And now these so-called Romans, who are now referring to themselves as Europeans, have now broken up into tribes, like the British, like the Italian, like the Belgian, or the Frank. Really started with the Franconians, right? And then they start breaking up into their thing, and then they start taking a little bit of science and stuff that they have to then start to create or whatever, learn tactics of war, and now they start to practice their version again of this outlaw Christianity that Arius and them had shut down all of those years before. Now they're starting to do it. Then there's a whole faction of them called the Corvins, right, or the Corvinius, and they established a duchy for themselves called Drakensberg. This is around the late 1600s, around the time of Vlad Tepes. And he takes over Wallachia, and they establish a duchy for themselves. And then from that duchy, they establish a customary language and culture that is fostered under the draconian system, which again is just the old ancient idol worship, human sacrifice stuff. You see what I'm saying? That they're now bringing into this new time. And now as the Corvinians or the Drakensbergs, they then institute that this is how they are able to live, because they have a charter to do that. See what I'm saying? And now this brings rise again to all of this ancient evil that they're now putting under the banner of Christianity. One of the orders that they had was the Order of the Green Dragon. And from there, they established the Imperial Dragon Court. See what I'm saying? And then through the Dragon Court, any areas that they took over after fighting with the Moors or fighting with the ancient Turks or whatever, they now could apply that system there. And now they had a system to be able to bloodlet again, you see what I'm saying, under the guise of whatever laws and the structure that they had established. And then that eventually gets adopted. They then start to marry into these West Asian, aka European families. And then this is where you get the papal bloodlines again, where you get the Ordoncini, and you get the Coburgs, and then you get all of them. You see what I'm saying? And then those Moors are fighting against that in what we'll refer to now today as the Holy Roman Empire, right? Which was based under the protection of the Pappenheim and which is really Wappenheim, but the Pappenheim and the Burgundies and Lombards and the Bourbons and these types of Moors, the Northumbrians, these Moors, they're fighting against this now. However, because they're not a part of the greater empire, you see what I'm saying? They still technically are following the Roman thing. They wind up getting absorbed too. And so now all of the so-called noble families of these papal bloodlines are now using this version again of the Christianity, Christ being the divine nature of man, eanity, meaning the lack of substance, right? And they're using that as a shield now to then basically put the Roman church back on top. And then that's what basically led to the Crusades. From the Crusades, the Inquisition. From the Crusades, you get the Reconquista. From the Reconquista, you get the Inquisition. From the Inquisition, Reconquista, then you get the Renaissance, right? This is now they redoing everything now and putting everything back under the old banner of human sacrifice, war, and all that stuff. And then, like I said, the Moors basically retreat back over here. You see? And they keep this thing as secret and everything up until, like I said, 1492. And then that's when they get Christopher Colon, who is one of the biggest families. And again, at this time, these are melanated people. Just amalgamated. And Colon, then his family was fighting with the Pisos family, and then eventually they merged. They married into each other. And then the Pisos and the Colon come over here and establish Colombia. You see what I'm saying? And so from Colombia or Colon, we get the Colombians, and then the Colombians, then that's the goddess, you see what I'm saying, that they're establishing their state under. This is where we get Columbia Pictures, the nation of Columbia, the district of Columbia. You see what I'm saying? Columbine, Collins Avenue, the Collins family. This is all the same people. It's all Columbus. So in essence, the District of Columbia is, in America, fell under the jurisdiction of the Pisos and the Colon. The Pisos side of the family then eventually established the Virginia Plymouth colony. Right? And then time after that, right around the time of Reconstruction, they reconsolidate themselves and create what they call the Charleston-Cincinnati Railroad Company. They put all of that into a trust in the railroad. And then from that company, that became the basis of them now extending a jurisdiction all over the land, right? Through the railroad, through that, because they've taken over, essentially, and basically created a corporate version or an admiralty version over the real allodial inherited estate version. Because now by this time we have been broken up, you know what I mean, into different so-called clans. And now the Moorish thing had been deprived. The Moorish aspect of the family had been kept secret now because there was too many people who were marrying into the family who were trying to find out who were the Moorish dominion or the Moorish descent people directly in the family and kill them. And so your tribal name, which let's say was Johnson, then your Moorish title, which was Bey or Il or whatever, they worked in tandem, right? Now that the Moorish side was now being put under kill orders, they had to hide that. And then they started to use their tribal names as their national or imperial names. And then that's when they started to be redesignated as American Indians and all of this other stuff.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. I got more questions, but I gotta get ready for this next little presentation. I gotta get ready for with Brother Abdullah Bey.
It's on.
I thank you. Much thank you. If they help me get this video to double the last one, I'm gonna be coming to you again for the presentation, you know.
Islam. But one book, series of books you could get on this is Sex and Race, volumes 1 and 3 by J.A. Rogers, Superman and Man, J.A. Rogers, The Consecrated Talismans, Prince Uriel Bey, peace be upon him, When Nations Gather by Sultan Abdul Latif, The Wars in Barbary by Irwin, Diplomatic Relations Between the United States and the Barbary Powers. Definitely get that. The End of Iberian Rule in America, Time Walker, of course, Forgotten Cause of the Civil War, and Othello's Children in the New World, Golden Age of the Moor, and a book called The Arius Conspiracy.
Right, that's
All
that's
right.
some tools right there. That's a good 10 books right there you just dropped. So yeah, that's gonna be something to look into. I got that J.A. Rogers. What is it called? 100 Facts About the Negro with Complete
Yeah,
Proof.
that one's good too.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
got
all J. Rogers books, and all he did was talk about the Moors. They said low key was a part of the temple.
Let's look into that. Well, yeah, man, I appreciate you giving me your time, brother. Much love and support, you know, and I appreciate you, like I'm saying. So thank you.
Islam, honors to the Moors, long live the empire. Pax et amor, perconi malut laudibus.
Islam, thank you, brother.
Islam, bro. Peace.